Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, great one to educate us.
Oh, wow. All right, so today is the history of Christmas, or what that you can study in 35 minutes or so. So, as most of the topics we address in here, it's a pretty broad and pretty big topic. But before we get started with that, I'm going to do a little. I don't know why I like doing this so much, but I want to do a little quiz, and you can just keep up with you for yourself. So what we'll do is I'll ask the question, then we'll wait a few seconds, let everybody come up with their answer, and then we'll see what the answer is. So some of these are simple, some not so much. Who were the first humans that heard about Jesus' birth, other than, of course, Mary and Joseph? What'd you say?
Shepherds?
Shepherds, that's correct. See, pretty simple. Other than Mary and Joseph, who was the first human to proclaim Jesus as Lord? I'll give you a further hint if you don't already have. It was even before his birth.
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. There we go. Very good. And who was the emperor of Rome when Jesus was born? Anyone? Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus, but who also went by another name. There were two correct answers there. The first 8 years of his reign, he went by another name. Well, we'll just move on. Caesar Augustus is good enough. Who are the top producing states for Christmas trees? Give you another hint. There's
North
one on the West
Carolina.
Coast and one on the East Coast.
North Carolina.
North Carolina is one of them.
Oregon.
Oregon, that's correct. Oregon's actually the largest producer. Yeah.
I thought it was Canada. No?
That's not a state. Shit, come on now. I don't mean to be rude, but
No, but in the Christmas tree world, don't
oh
they
yeah, I
produce
don't know.
more?
It could be. I have no idea.
Okay.
I only focused on states.
I get it. I get it.
Why is Christmas sometimes abbreviated Xmas? A debate around that subject. Yes.
The unknown.
No.
Cross.
No.
From the Cairo symbol?
You're getting closer. I'm getting closer. So the Greek word for Chris is Christos, which begins with an X. So it was abbreviated Xmas, meaning Christ Mass, back in the 16th century. So it's been around a very long time. You know, some people think this is a modern version of trying to get Christ out of Christmas or whatever, but this is an ancient practice. Now, how people interpret it today is, you know, so if people perceive it as trying to take Christ out of Christmas, then we as Christians should be aware of that and pay attention to that. But that was not the original thing. Why do we use candy canes around Christmas? On trees. They used to be one of the major decorations on trees.
Shepherds.
Shepherds, right. Exactly. And it to celebrate, they did it as a candy to celebrate abundance and joy, and you know, back in the day when sugar and things were not as easy to come by, that was quite a statement of luxury and of just joyful extravagance, sort of. Yeah. Here's one you'll all get. How many days are there in Christmas?
12.
12. You've heard the song, right? What do we call the day after Christmas, and what does it celebrate?
Boxing Day.
See, listen. No, I just gave you a hint. There's 12 days in Christmas, so the day after Christmas is Epiphany. Good job, Charles.
Well, it is.
From what country did the traditions of decorating evergreens, of decorating trees, of what we kind of view as so central to Christmas, where'd that originate? Germany. There we go. This is one you may not get. I didn't know this. What major European country downplays the importance of Christmas? Which major European country downplays the importance of Christmas? Even has rules around it.
España.
No, Scotland.
Scotland.
Is there a reason why?
It is. We'll get into that a little bit later. This is a kind of a silly one. When, plus or minus 20 years, was the first Christmas card designed and sold? It's further back than I would have thought, but
1850.
ooh, 18 1843. That's very good.
Whoa.
Right.
I'm 3 for 3.
Someone painted, artist John Horsley painted a card for his friend and sent it, and this friend was like a lord or whatever, and liked it so much that he had him do it for all of his friends and so forth and so on, and it kind of took off from there, but 1843. So, that's not the kind of history of Christmas we came here to discuss, though. That's some of the stuff around Christmas. But we want to talk about Christmas and its origins. And the first question we ask is, when was Jesus born? David addressed this for us last week. When was Jesus born? Nobody knows.
4 BC, maybe.
Yeah, 4 BC maybe. That's one theory, and that one really goes around. So I've told you before that in the ancient world they really tried to, they did, date things based on rulers who were in power. So if you said this was in the 15th year of so-and-so, the 3rd year of so-and-so, then they said, okay, we can triangulate this if we got 2 or 3 references and figure out what year this was. Now, why there wasn't a 46 BC or that, I don't know the answer to that. But that's the way they tried to name dates. And so when it comes to pinpointing the year of Jesus' birth, they've used those records that we have, and they're starting to use, or have for the last 100 years or whatever, what they believe to be astrological records around things that might have been happening, and then making their best guess around that. So the best guesses are 4 BC or 1 BC. Those are kind of the historians' best guesses at when that might have occurred. This whole idea of AD and BC, you all are probably aware of this, but this whole way of counting all this didn't begin till the 600s. It was a Scythian monk. His name was Dionysius, I believe. Dionysius. But anyway, he came up with this idea of AD and BC. AD being Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, right? And he was the one who first set Jesus' birth at X. He set it at 1 AD, okay? And then, so that was when that calendar started.
So
Now,
he was close.
do what?
He was close.
Well, and some argue, so, looking back, these historians, nobody says, oh yeah, that's when it was. Many people say, no, we suspect he was closer to the source, closer to that information, even though it's 600 years later, but they say, we believe that he probably understood far better than we do how all the ancient calendars and stuff work. There are a lot of people who said, no, we think his number is probably the correct one. So, again, it's a debate. But this idea of counting, and for what it's worth, I don't think I realized this till I was far too old. There's no 0. There's
No
1
year
BC
zero.
and 1 AD. There's no 0, right? 0 wasn't even invented when they came up with this calendar. The Arabians, mathematicians, came up with that number later on, after that 600. So that idea of 0 wasn't a thing. So there's no 0 year. So because when you looked at it, you say, well, if it's 1 BC or 1, that's a 2-year gap. No, it's not in math where we go from negative to positive. You have to pass through 0. It's 1 BC, 1 AD. Okay. So BC has come to mean before Christ, but that came up with a guy named Bede, an English monk, much later. So that's why 1 is in Latin and 1 is in English. Okay. It's kind of a mishmash
That
there.
was before Common Era.
Well, that's BCE. So that's what historians have come to call CE, Common Era, and BCE, before Common Era, to take Christ out of.
Oh, okay.
Now, even in that attempt to take Christ out of, the inflection point is Christ's birth.
Right, gotcha.
So you can't, regardless of how you try to take it out, you really can't if you're going to calculate it
So
in
the
that way.
Common
at all.
Era thing was an attempt to de-Christianize the
Yes,
map.
to de-Christianize the calendar,
Gotcha.
certainly. But that AD and BC, those came much later. So when Jesus was born, we don't know. So then we say, okay, if we don't know what year, but we know roughly what year, then what time of year, right? Must have been December 25th, right? No, probably not. Almost certainly not. There are numerous attempts. There are some who come to say, okay, it was in September. There are others who said it's in March. Some based on the fact that there were shepherds in the fields with their flocks. They say, okay, well that would have been most likely happening in the springtime, not in December. So it must have been springtime. There's all sorts of guesses, all sorts of ways that people have gone about saying, okay, let's sit down and try to do the math. But the reality again is, no one knows. No one knows. Yes.
Historically, there was a big overlap between the early followers of Jesus and sun worshippers.
Yep, we're going to get into that.
And so they picked the birth of the sun
Don't
to
spoil
be
it.
Jesus' birth. The sun is born at the shortest day of the year, and that's how they picked his birth.
Okay. So as he said, what ultimately happened? So you have Christianity is entering into a pagan world, right? And in many ways, this is something quite frankly I struggle with. Maybe you all do, but when you read the history of some of these things, you see the church really scheduling so many things around pagan festivals, around pagan rituals, around some of the things. You think, oh, I don't feel too good about that, right? It doesn't feel right. On the other hand, though, I have to remind myself that if you are entering into a society, I mean, how many times have we looked at missionaries in history who have gone into an area and said, no, everything you have done, everything you've done is wrong. And you're sinful and terrible, and we're going to throw it all out. And we think, oh, that's terrible, that's horrible. And we applaud these missionaries who go into a society and say, hey, let's take what's good about yours, we'll add what's good about ours, and we'll find a way to mix them together, okay? And so that's some of what's happening here. They're coming into these pagan societies, and they're trying to say, how can we Christianize these societies? So one such attempt is how we come about Christmas. So the biggest festival of the year in Roman society, pagan society, was Saturnalia. And people pronounce that differently, but Saturnalia was a festival to Saturn. It was an 8-day festival that was wild, to say the least.
Mardi Gras on steroids.
Mardi Gras on steroids, absolutely. So in the earliest days of Saturnalia, it included sacrifices, human and otherwise. As it progressed along, it came to be gladiatorial sacrifice. So in those 8 days, there would be lots of gladiator matches, and the gladiators who were killed were thought to be an offering to Saturn and to the gods, and etc. Even as some of that failed, though, or some of that, I guess, kind of went away a little bit, particularly as we start getting closer and closer to the Christianization of Roman society. It was still a wild, wild party. So lots of drinking, lots of eating. That whole idea, we've heard of these parties in the ancient world where people would eat and drink till they were sick. They'd go out and make themselves throw up so they could come back in and eat some more. It was that kind of party. It was all sorts
hedonistic.
of very hedonistic. Along with that, all sorts of debauchery, sexual hedonism, you name it. It was there, and it was a wild time. It was a time where they inverted some societal norms. So for one day during Saturnalia, at least for a very long period of time, the lords, those who owned slaves, would take on the slave's role, and the slaves would take on the master's role. And obviously there's going to be some lines you don't cross there, but for that one day, the masters would serve the slaves and etc. They had a tradition that may sound familiar to you. It's called a bean cake. They'd bake a cake and they'd put one hard bean in it. And if you got the bean, you were what was known as the Lord of Misrule. So you were kind of the king of that party for the day, and you could tell people to do all sorts of silly things, and they would have to do those things for you. And much like the king cake that we see in Mardi Gras, it's that same idea.
So it was to blow off steam.
Yes, I mean, I think that's ultimately It was a time to invert things a little bit for
Let loose.
people to let loose. So there were even rules around this that said no one could be prosecuted for damaging property.
Oh,
No one could be prosecuted for injuring people in this 8-day celebration. So I mean, kind of crazy. So for all the craziness, there are plenty of
And what was that called?
Saturnalia. So there were lots of examples of people. Yeah. So all this stuff's in here. And again, you can take this home and read. This isn't something you need to try to read through today.
well, we have one at home.
Oh,
I
okay.
So-
don't, do you have one? Oh, okay.
So during this 8 days, there were plenty of examples of people who said, who wrote about it and said, I want nothing to do with this. They stayed locked up in their room as much as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So like all things, it wasn't that everyone was out in the streets going wild. There were plenty of examples of people who said, this is craziness. I want nothing to do with it. But the point being, this was a huge festive occasion. It was very important in pagan society. So as Christianity comes along, they say, okay, how are we going to celebrate the birth of Christ in this society? And so what they came up with is on that day after the last day of Saturnalia, the day after the 25th, they said, okay, people are already in a festive mood. This is already, everything's already shut down, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to make this the day of our Lord's birth. But that wasn't till like 336 is the first time that we see that written anywhere anyway, that was when they first celebrated Christmas Day. And it came on the heels of this Saturnalia. Other parts of the world, so that's in Rome, so other parts of the world, Alexandria in the east and stuff, they come to celebrate September 25th, one in 388 and the other sometime in the 4th century. But by the middle of the 4th century, kind of the whole Christian world has accepted this December 25th as the celebration.
So when Moses came with the tablets and everything went to hell in a handbasket, was that part of this or just another uprising of?
No, I don't know. The ultimate question is I have no idea what they were celebrating or whatever. I think that would have been a Saturnalia-like celebration, although they had created their own golden calves,
Yeah,
which would have
that's
been
what
their own kind of deity.
Uh-huh.
So it wouldn't have been a celebration to Saturn per se, but it would have had the same kind of idea as that, certainly.
Well, throughout history, people have been dependent on the sun to grow their crops. And so the sun was very important for agriculture. And as in the fall, you get less and less sun, and you pray for the sun to come back again. And the date when it starts getting bigger again is the birth of the sun. And it goes way back thousands of years.
So at the end of Saturnalia, as I'd said early on in in our recorded versions of its celebration, at the end on that last day is when they would have had their big sacrifice, and they would have taken someone who generally was known to be awful, and that's the person that would have been sacrificed. And the symbolism there was that by killing this person, they are driving out evil and darkness from the world. That was the symbolism. And so that notion, even if human sacrifice didn't continue all the way through, that idea that the last day of that celebration was this driving out of sin and darkness. They wouldn't have called it sin, but of darkness and evil from the world.
Like a cleansing?
Yeah, like a cleansing. And so that was another one of the reasons why they said, okay, December 25th, that day after that, is probably a good day for us to celebrate Christ coming into the world. So all of this starts to work together. So why is Christmas celebrated in 1 AD? Because a monk in the 6th century said that's when it was. He did a lot of, and he was a brilliant historian. It wasn't like It wasn't like I sat down one day and said, "Let me figure this out," and next day I came up with a report. This must have been one. No, this was a brilliant historian who spent his life doing kind of work. And so it was 1 AD. Why is it December 25th? Because that's when the pagans were ready to celebrate, right? Is basically what it boils down to. So,
And also the growing season is over.
yeah,
This conclusion.
certainly.
You're waiting for
Courts are closed.
spring.
Yeah.
So-
So in an agricultural society, certainly wintertime is the time to party, right? It's the time to celebrate. Harvests are all in. You have a 2 or 3 months there where there's not a whole lot to do. Hopefully you've put your fields to bed already, but you're not ready to start the work of getting them prepared again. So yeah, this was that end of the year time to blow off some steam for sure, for sure. So we've got this date set now, 366 for Rome, 388 in the east, 400. So what happens? Obviously, all of a sudden, everyone is going to clean up their act, right? Because now we're celebrating the birth of our Lord. Right? That's what should happen. No, that's not at all what happens. For the next 1,000+ years, the Christmas celebration, even once Saturnalia is removed from the celebration. So we're talking about in the Middle Ages, we're talking about in Europe, things. This 12 days of Christmas becomes the 12 days of Saturnalia, only it starts the 25th
Oh,
and ends the 5th, but very little else has changed. Now, certainly in the Middle Ages, some of the debaucherous nature of it, if you will, there was certainly a quelling of that. The church said, "Whoa, now this is," at least officially, the church said, "This is too much." But the eating, the drinking, the partying, the festival-like atmosphere continued big time. So this was again a 12 days of blowing off steam, 12 days of a street party, the likes of which most of us would be wildly uncomfortable with. Okay,
Or have an awesome time.
maybe for a couple of days anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Christmas through the Middle Ages really, as I said, was celebrated in this kind of festive fashion, this partying fashion. So the idea of gift giving. So again, I don't think I mentioned this, but in Saturnalia, they gave gifts, silly gifts, what we would call gag gifts, but they exchanged gifts. Nonetheless, they sang songs about it. There were kind of traditional songs around that festival that they would sing year after year, and so some of those traditions carry on over into Christmas. The giving of gifts was still largely not. It wasn't something that everybody expected a gift from everyone, or that children expected a mass amount of toys under the tree, or that all happens in really your all's lifetime. But this idea of gift giving, of singing, of merriment, it continues up through the Middle Ages. Anyone want to guess when we first see that really begin to turn around, when we see it begin to change of Christmas as a celebration in that regard? 1900s?
Late 1800s.
Okay. So in some places, so in the United States, for instance, we see it really from its founding, from the Puritans coming over. The Puritans outlawed Christmas because they knew of its pagan heritage. They knew of the party ways and things. So for the first couple hundred years, really, and I'm talking about from the kind of earliest settlers, Christmas, while celebrated in some places in some ways, was not a major holiday in the United States in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the first, I think I put in here somewhere, the first state to legalize Christmas was Alabama, and it was like in 1860 something, if I recall correctly.
not Massachusetts.
No, certainly not Massachusetts. So that kind of Puritan influence really dramatically changed how we celebrate Christmas. And it changed it largely in not only the U.S., but ultimately that went back across the ocean to Europe.
By putting the brakes on it of sorts.
Yeah, by saying, look, this as Christians, our idea of celebrating Christ's birth shouldn't be a drunken festival. That wasn't the idea, but that was very much a kind of a Puritan reformist. So some of this comes out of the Reformation, obviously, the Puritan movement. Much of this comes out of the Reformation idea. So early on, for what it's worth, in the Roman Church, which was the only church, but we see historical documents of church leaders doing all sorts of crazy things during Christmas on that kind of 25th day, that first day, which was, of course, the biggest day of the celebration. You have priests dancing around in drag at the altar and all sorts of things. And I'm not saying that was the norm, but that level of there was one day that they were kind of let off the hook, that they said, okay, you're not going to get in trouble for whatever it is you decide to do today, until you have these priests who are drunk and dancing and all sorts of crazy things going on. And so it's in the Reformation movement says, not only should we be reforming the church, but we should be reforming a lot of our habits, a lot of the ways that we celebrate, a lot of the ways that we look at the calendar in general. That gets into the veneration of saints and all sorts of things that come along in the Reformation. But one of the things that ultimately change out of the Reformation is how we celebrate Christmas. And so this idea of a puritanical Christmas celebration or whatever is still something that's largely in the West. Has anybody here ever celebrated Christmas or Easter in South America? Or okay, any difference?
That's hot.
Okay. There you go. That's not that much different from here, but
But the candles, I mean, at midnight service, kind of bend over, and it's just a very, there's no snow, there's no,
yeah.
Frosty the Snowman is not a.
No, that's certainly not a picture of it. Is it a more festive atmosphere around it all?
I would say no. It's almost,
Sober?
it's much more, I mean, it's one holiday, it's only because it's kind of the beginning of the summer school break. And
Yeah. And what about at Easter? Is that a
much bigger deal.
yeah? That's what I thought. So yeah, so in those places that weren't as impacted by that puritanical notion, they still have this idea that around Christian holidays should be festive.
Parties.
Festival, this whole idea of it should be celebrated. I've often, as I was older and realized, with Hispanic friends and people that I knew, it's all these people named Jesus. I didn't think of it. I realized, oh wait, that's Jesus. They named people for Jesus, and that idea of that celebratory nature of their faith is I won't say it's a holdover by any means, but it was not quenched by Puritanism by the West, and so much of that carries over, and they have celebrations around other festivals that would be much more celebratory than what we would typically see or be accustomed to. So anyway, this idea of Christmas really changes a lot. As you'd said in the 1800s, the whole idea of, okay, we're going to first of all get Christmas trees. We talked about that. That's a very much a Germanic idea, a history. I mean, what could be better than a dry tree with candles on? About adding some excitement to the season.
They hung them upside down.
Oh, really? And how does that work?
They hung them from the ceiling upside
The
down.
trunk.
Oh, the tree.
The
You're
tree.
saying, but how?
Really?
But the candles were
Queen
upright.
Victoria and her husband was
Yes,
German,
yes.
and he was
I thought
the
you were
first
saying.
one
I thought
that-
you were saying the candles were
No,
held
no,
upside
no,
down.
no.
Yeah,
Okay.
originally
Okay.
upside
So they
down.
mounted something on the
Yeah.
ceiling?
Yeah.
Or, yeah,
Well,
hung
and
it.
for a chandelier would have been, yeah.
Yeah,
That did last
Yeah.
year.
yeah, yeah. And so again, then, I'm laughing a little because of our notion of Christmas tree, but then they would have gone out on the 24th, cut a fresh tree. It would have been put up that evening
Yeah.
with candles that evening that they were sitting around watching. You know, it's not like they were gonna light the candles and let's go to the store. You know, kind of like it wasn't that notion. It was a very particular day, a very particular kind of event, and they would leave them up for those 12 days. But this idea that there would constantly be candles on them is kind of a figment of our imagination. But this idea of decorating the greenery. Now, this notion of decorating greenery was really about celebrating life, right? And if you are living in Germany, if you're living really in a lot of the Western Hemisphere, and on the 25th, you want to put up something that's going to represent life, well, an evergreen's about your only decent choice, right? You don't want to go out and cut a oak tree that's devoid of all its leaves and bring it in and be like, oh, how lovely this is, right? And that's where the evergreens, it's this idea of life, and that was the one place where they saw life. Out in the forest. We get this idea of evergreens. Lockwood, did you have something you
Yes,
want to say?
throughout history, the Christian missionaries have co-opted pagan customs and rituals as part of the conversion process.
Certainly.
And when Christianity came to Greece, they converted the temple to the Virgin Goddess Athena, became the Church of the Virgin Mary. And we see this throughout history. The celebration of life with the greens was a pagan custom. And the church has co-opted that, just like through missionaries throughout the world have co-opted pagan customs. So the pagan custom of bringing in the greens in the winter becomes part of the Christian ceremony. As she said, as Queen Victoria and her husband relatively recently started the tree thing.
Yep. So our modern notion of Christmas, with the Christmas tree, with the songs, if you go back and trace, you know, every old Christmas tune that you love doesn't go back all that far. I mean, in relative terms.
Yeah.
Yep.
They're all somewhat, 200 years or less kind of time frame. And so the whole idea of Christmas has radically changed in the last 200 years or so, we'll call it. Maybe a little more than that, maybe a little less, depending on where you want to mark it. But Christmas trees, sitting around singing all of our favorite carols. This idea of a quiet, simple, some would call reverent kind of worship of Christmas has really come along in that time. And again, part of it is a reflection of kind of puritanical American ideals, but some of it, as I said, traveled back across the ocean. And people over there started seeing some of what we're doing here and said, you know what, that feels a little more like how we want to worship God. So this Reformation movement that's happening on the continent, as it's referred to, sees some of what's happening here and vice versa. You know, everything then went back and forth, but they see this back and forth and they say, you know what, that feels a little more like what this should be. And so our notion of Christmas, what we celebrate today, is influenced by that. And then going into what you would consider in the last 70-ish so years of commercialization of Christmas. And so many of us, like for me growing up, probably much of my notion of Christmas was really commercialized Christmas versus what I hear my parents or grandparents talking about what their notion of Christmas was as children. Very, very different experiences. So our idea of even Santa Claus, obviously comes from St. Nicholas, and we could, I've given you some history there, you could read at home if you want. But this idea of Santa Claus really comes much later, and it becomes a big deal like in the 1930s As you all know, the Santa Claus that we see is a Coca-Cola advertisement. That's the Santa that every kid in my generation or my kids, at least in America, when they think of Santa Claus, they think of that Coca-Cola advertisement Santa Claus. There were different versions of Santa Claus prior to that. St. Nicholas started to be referred to as Santa Claus for a variety of reasons, some of which they'll tell you about in there.
He was the patron saint of children.
Yep.
And so that's logical that St. Nicholas legend would grow out of that.
Yeah, but the idea of this kind of red suit with the white and all of that. Now, Nick, what was the guy? I think I put it there. Thomas Nast. Yeah, he was a caricaturist and kind of a satirist, and he had done a poem about Christmas, and it was the first one to kind of put that notion forward. But the jolliness, the big beard, all of that was that kind of Coca-Cola model of it. So overall, when we look at Christmas, it has gone from what you would argue as not a celebration even, and when I say not a celebration is in the early church, we have little if any documentation of them celebrating Christmas. Like when did they celebrate the birth of Christ? Well, they didn't. And part of that is that in that time and place, and one of the reasons I'd say that we don't have a date for Jesus' birth is that people didn't pay much attention to birth dates. It was not they didn't celebrate birthdays. They didn't pay attention to, okay, I was born on this date and this year, so today I am 42 years old and 36 days. They
didn't have a calendar. Why bother?
Yes, they didn't pay a lot of attention to that stuff, and so when the early church celebrated Christmas, we don't know. We don't know if they even did. Was this birth date of Christ? They certainly celebrate Easter. We have plenty of documentation of that, but very little, if anything, about Easter or about Christmas rather. And so we move from that for the few hundred years. And 336, as I said, you get this first naming of Christmas on that day after Saturnalia, the 25th. It grows into 12 days. Still very raucous, still quite a party up until the kind of Reformation. In America, you get the puritanical slant on it where it's outlawed. And it's outlawed, like I said, it is illegal in every state until Alabama legalizes
It
it.
was a papist ceremony, and you got to blame it on Martin Luther.
Well, some would argue that, certainly. That,
Others of us might not, but that's.
you can blame a lot of bad stuff on Martin Luther and his
I
followers.
wonder, I think many of us feel the tension between the commercial world and the faith-based world around Christmas time, right? And, we're all sort of sometimes appalled,
Right.
But I wonder whether in some ways we've gone back to the commercial version of the Saturnella.
Certainly. I think certainly this idea that it's more of a party than a celebration of Jesus. I don't think there's any doubt that a Martian that landed on Earth looking at Christmas in the United States would say, well, this may be ever so slightly a religious holiday, but it's more of a commercial party festival type of thing than that. Yeah, I think there's no question about that. So one of the questions that this history raises and where we find ourselves is what can we do about it? I don't know. I think outside of your own home, that's a tough one. Outside of the things that you choose to frequent, the things that you choose to support with your money and your time, I think that's really the only voice that we have around this stuff. So if people still go to stores on November 10th that are blaring Christmas music to buy Christmas presents, well, of course the stores are going to sell them. That's what they're there for. That's their purpose. So it's not until society says no thanks with their pocketbooks and their time that anything would change.